Sometimes the people we walk past every day are the very ones who will save our lives. In one terrifying moment, everything Margaret Chen thought mattered: her corner office, her million-dollar deals, her untouchable reputation meant nothing as she lay trapped in twisted metal on a deserted highway. The homeless man who pulled her to safety didn't know she was a powerful CEO. He didn't care about her wealth or status. He simply saw a human being who needed help and asked the question that would haunt her: "Are you okay?" Now she's determined to find the man everyone else ignores, the man who showed her what real strength looks like. But what happens when the city's most successful woman discovers her savior has been living right under her nose all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gold nameplate on Margaret Chen's mahogany desk caught the morning light, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 42nd floor. Margaret Chen, CEO. It read in elegant serif font, a declaration of power that had taken her 23 years to earn. At 52, she commanded respect in boardrooms across the country, her steel gray suits as sharp as her business acumen. Her morning routine was precise black coffee at exactly 7:15, financial reports by 7:30, first meeting at 8 sharp. Margaret's fingers traced the edge of her tablet as she reviewed quarterly projections. The numbers told a story of relentless growth, market dominance, and strategic acquisitions that have built her technology consulting firm into a billion-dollar empire. Her assistant knocked precisely at 7:45. "Your 8 o'clock is here early," Jennifer announced through the heavy oak door. "Send them in 5 minutes," Margaret replied without looking up. Punctuality was a virtue she practiced religiously, but she never rewarded others for arriving ahead of schedule. It set dangerous precedents. The city sprawled below her window, like a chessboard of glass and concrete. From this height, the streets looked orderly, predictable. People moved in patterns she understood: purpose-driven, goal-oriented, measurable. She had spent decades learning to read those patterns, to anticipate market trends and human behavior with algorithmic precision. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter, Emma, in Seattle. "Dad's birthday dinner Sunday. You coming?" Margaret stared at the message, calculating. She had 3 client presentations next week, a board meeting on Tuesday, and the Morrison acquisition required her personal attention. She typed back, "We'll try. Depends on Morrison deal." The reply came instantly. "Of course it does." Margaret set the phone aside, returning to her reports. Emma had never understood the sacrifices necessary for success. At 26, her daughter had the luxury of idealism, working for a non-profit environmental group and living in a studio apartment that cost more per month than Margaret's first-year salary. But Emma's rent checks came from a trust fund Margaret had built through years of 12-hour days and weekend sacrifices. 5 miles across the city, in the shadow of the downtown overpass, Samuel Martinez was folding his sleeping bag with the same methodical care Margaret applied to her morning routine. The concrete alcove that served as his shelter was swept clean, his few possessions organized in a weathered backpack that had seen better decades. At 57, Samuel moved with the deliberate economy of someone who understood that energy was a precious resource. His day began before dawn, not by choice but by necessity. The early morning hours belonged to the homeless before commuters arrived, before police patrols increased, before the invisible became visible to the housed world above. Samuel made his way to the public restroom 3 blocks away, where he performed his own morning ritual with a bar of soap he kept wrapped in a torn washcloth. The mirror above the sink reflected a face weathered by 5 years of street life, but still carrying traces of the man he used to be. His beard was neatly trimmed with scissors borrowed from the shelter, his graying hair combed back with dampened fingers. Pride, he had learned, was one of the few things that couldn't be taken away. Samuel's routine included a stop at the corner deli where Mr. Kim, the elderly owner, sometimes had day-old pastries that needed disposing of. It was charity disguised as waste management, a transaction that preserved dignity on both sides. "Morning, Samuel," Mr. Kim called as the bell jingled above the door. "Help me with these boxes?" Samuel spent 20 minutes unloading a delivery truck, earning a coffee and 2 bagels that Mr. Kim claimed were too hard to sell. They both understood the fiction, and both participated willingly. With breakfast secured, Samuel made his way to Meridian Park, where he had discovered a bench positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun. He pulled a worn spiral notebook from his backpack and began writing observations about the people who passed, reflections on the small kindnesses and casual cruelties that shaped each day. "Tuesday morning," he wrote in careful cursive. "Mrs. Rodriguez from the flower shop asked about my arthritis. Teenagers on skateboards shared their water when they saw me limping. Construction worker pretended not to see me when I nodded hello. Most people look through me like I'm made of glass." Samuel had been keeping this journal for 3 years, documenting the invisible life of the city's forgotten population. He wrote about Mary, who collected bottles with religious dedication and sent money to her sister in El Salvador. About Tommy, the Vietnam veteran whose nightmares echoed under the bridge at 3 a.m. About Lisa, barely 19, who had aged decades in the 2 months since arriving from somewhere she wouldn't discuss. The notebook contained philosophy born from necessity, wisdom earned through loss. Samuel understood human nature from a perspective Margaret's corner office could never provide. He saw people's true character and how they treated those with nothing to offer in return. As Margaret prepared for her first meeting, a negotiation that would determine whether her company acquired a smaller competitor, Samuel was preparing for his own kind of strategy session. The homeless community had its own network, its own intelligence gathering, its own systems of mutual support. Samuel had become something of an unofficial coordinator, matching people with resources, mediating disputes, and maintaining the delicate social fabric that kept the vulnerable from disappearing entirely. His morning rounds included checking on elderly Jerry, who slept behind the library and sometimes forgot to take his heart medication. Samuel kept a spare bottle, prescribed to him but shared freely. He stopped by the corner where Maria sold newspapers, bringing her the extra bagel, and listening to updates about her son's progress in community college. These interactions weren't charity, they were community. Samuel had learned that survival required connection, that dignity demanded mutual respect. That hope lived in the spaces between people who refused to become invisible to each other. By 9 a.m., Margaret was deep in spreadsheets and strategic planning. By 9 a.m., Samuel was settling into his post near the bus stop, where he offered quiet greetings to commuters and sometimes received loose change or kind words in return. Neither was aware of the other's existence, yet both were navigating the same city with the same fundamental human needs: purpose, connection, and the desire to matter. Margaret's gold nameplate reflected her achievements in a language the world understood: titles, positions, measurable success. Samuel's notebook contained achievements the world rarely recognized: preserved dignity, sustained hope, community built from nothing but shared humanity. As the morning progressed toward the moment that would bring these two worlds into collision, both Margaret and Samuel continued their routines, unaware that their carefully ordered lives were about to intersect in ways that would transform them both. The distance between the 42nd floor and the street below was about to become irrelevant, measured not in floors, but in the space between one human heart and another. In a few hours, Margaret's gold nameplate would mean nothing, and Samuel's gentle question would mean everything. The rain had been falling steadily since 10 p.m., turning the city streets into mirrors that reflected neon signs and streetlights in fractured patterns. Margaret Chen pressed her foot harder against the accelerator. As she navigated the nearly empty highway, her Mercedes sedan responding with the quiet precision of German engineering. The Morrison acquisition documents sat in her briefcase on the passenger seat. The culmination of 8 months of negotiations that would close tomorrow morning. Her phone rang through the car's sound system. Emma's name appeared on the dashboard. Display. "I can't talk long," Margaret said, accepting the call without taking her eyes off the road. "I'm driving home from dinner with the Morrison people." "Mom, about Dad's birthday. I told you I'd try to make it." "You know what try means." "Coming from you." Emma's voice carried the weary frustration of years of similar conversations. It means no, but with plausible deniability. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with family discussions. "Emma, this acquisition is important. It represents 18 months of work. Everything represents 18 months of work with you. Dad's 70 next week. How many more birthdays do you think he'll have?" The question hung in the air as Margaret approached the overpass that would take her home to her empty apartment. She had chosen the penthouse for its isolation, its commanding view of the city, its distance from the noise and chaos below. Tonight, that distance felt less like cess and more like separation. "We'll discuss this tomorrow," Margaret said, her standard response to conversations that threatened to spiral into emotional territory. "No, we won't. Tomorrow you'll be in another meeting, making another deal, climbing another mountain that doesn't actually exist." Margaret was about to respond when she saw the construction zone ahead. Orange cones channeled traffic into a single lane, and a digital sign flashed. "Lane ends 500 feet." She eased off the accelerator, checking her rearview mirror for approaching vehicles. "Emma, I have to focus on driving." The truck appeared in her peripheral vision like a metallic nightmare. The driver had fallen asleep or lost control. Margaret never knew which, but the 18-wheeler was drifting across the median, its headlights sweeping across her windshield like lighthouse beams. Time stretched into slow motion as she yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, feeling the Mercedes respond with a sickening skid on the rain-slicked asphalt. Emma's voice was still coming through the speakers. "Mom? Mom? Are you there?" The guardrail caught Margaret's car with a grinding shriek of metal against metal. She felt the vehicle lift, rotate, and then slam down the embankment with a series of impacts that rattled her teeth and filled her vision with airbag deployment and shattered glass. The Mercedes rolled twice before coming to rest against a concrete pillar, its luxury interior transformed into a cage of twisted steel and deployed safety systems. Silence. Complete. Absolute silence, except for the hiss of escaping steam and the distant sound of rain pattering on crumpled metal. Margaret tried to move and discovered that pain had geography she had never explored. Her left leg was pinned beneath the collapsed dashboard, and something warm was trickling down her forehead. The airbag had deflated, leaving her staring at a spider web of fractured windshield glass. "Help!" she whispered, then louder. "Help!" Her voice disappeared into the rain and darkness. The overpass was deserted at this hour, and her car was invisible from the highway above. Her phone had been thrown somewhere in the chaos, probably shattered like everything else in her once pristine world. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to assess her situation with the same analytical approach she brought to business problems. She was trapped but conscious, injured but alive. The engine had stopped running, which meant no fire risk. Someone would eventually notice her absence, but not until morning when she failed to appear for the Morrison meeting. That's when she heard footsteps. Samuel had been walking back to his shelter when he heard the crash metal screaming against concrete, the distinctive sound of violence meeting precision engineering. He lived close enough to tragedy to recognize its voice. His first instinct was to keep walking. Emergency responders would arrive eventually, and homeless men at accident scenes were more likely to be suspected than helpful. But something about the complete silence that followed the crash pulled at his conscience. Samuel had seen enough of life's fragility to understand that minutes mattered, that the difference between survival and loss often came down to whether someone cared enough to look. He climbed down the embankment carefully, using the concrete supports for balance. The Mercedes was wedged against a pillar at an angle that made the driver's side nearly inaccessible. Samuel worked his way around to the passenger side, where the door was crumpled but not completely sealed. Through the shattered window, he could see a woman slumped over the steering wheel, blood in her silver hair, her expensive suit torn and dirty. She was breathing shallow, rapid breaths that spoke of shock and pain. "Ma'am?" Samuel called softly. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Margaret's eyes opened slowly, focusing on a face she had never seen before, weathered, kind, framed by graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. "Are you okay?" Samuel asked, his voice gentle but urgent. Margaret tried to speak and managed only a whisper. "Trapped." Samuel could see the situation immediately. The dashboard had collapsed, pinning her leg. The door was jammed, but the window was large enough for access. He pulled off his jacket and used it to clear away the worst of the broken glass. "I'm going to get you out of there," he said, not asking permission, not waiting for authorization. "My name is Samuel. What's yours?" "Margaret," she managed. "Margaret Chen." "Okay, Margaret. I need you to stay awake and talk to me. Can you move your arms?" She tested her limbs carefully. Her right arm responded normally. Her left ached but functioned. "Yes, I think so." Samuel was already working on the door, using a piece of debris as a lever. His movements were economical, practiced, the hands of someone who had learned to solve problems without resources, to find solutions in situations where none seemed to exist. "I'm calling for help," he said, pulling an ancient flip phone from his pocket. The call to 911 was brief and precise. Location, injuries, urgency level. Then he was back at the window, reaching in to check her pulse and examine her injuries with surprising gentleness. "You're going to be fine," Samuel said, though Margaret could hear the concern beneath his calm exterior. "Ambulance is coming. I'm going to stay right here with you." Margaret found herself staring into the eyes of this stranger who had appeared from nowhere to help her. In 42 floors of corporate life, she had rarely encountered such immediate, unconditional assistance. There were no negotiations, no discussions of benefit or cost. He had simply seen someone in need and acted. "Who are you?" she asked. Samuel smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face. "Just someone who happened to be walking by." As sirens approached in the distance, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete dependence on the kindness of another person. This man named Samuel was keeping her conscious through the power of his presence, his voice, his absolute certainty that she mattered enough to save. When the paramedics arrived, Samuel guided them to the best access point, provided clear information about her condition, and then stepped back into the shadows as the professionals took over. Margaret tried to keep him in sight as they worked to extract her from the wreckage. But between the lights and the activity and the growing fog of pain medication, he seemed to fade like a figure from a dream. The last thing she remembered clearly was being loaded into the ambulance, reaching out with her good arm toward the place where Samuel had been standing. But the space was empty now, and she was left with only the memory of a gentle voice asking the simplest and most profound question she had heard in years. "Are you okay?" The crumpled business card they found later in the wreckage, blood-stained and torn, but still readable, bore the elegant serif font that had once defined her identity: Margaret Chen, CEO. But as the ambulance carried her away from the scene, that title seemed to belong to someone else. Someone who had existed before a stranger's kindness had changed everything. The fluorescent lights in Margaret's hospital room hummed with the persistent monotony of institutional efficiency. She had been awake for 6 hours, long enough to catalog her injuries: fractured left leg, 3 cracked ribs, a concussion that left her feeling like she was viewing the world through gauze. The morphine helped with the physical pain, but did nothing for the mental fog that seemed to wrap around her thoughts like cotton batting. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a woman about Emma's age with kind eyes and efficient hands, reviewed Margaret's chart with the thoroughness of someone who understood that healing was both science and art. "You're remarkably fortunate," Dr. Martinez said, settling into the visitor's chair with the ease of someone accustomed to delivering both good news and bad. "Another hour in that car, and hypothermia would have become a serious concern. The man who found you likely saved your life." Margaret shifted against her pillows, wincing as the movement pulled at her ribs. "The man who found me, did anyone get his name?" "The paramedics mentioned someone was there when they arrived, but he left before they could get information." "Is he a friend? Family member?" "I don't know who he was." The admission felt strange in Margaret's mouth. In her carefully ordered world, she always knew who people were, what they wanted, what they could offer in return. "He just appeared." Dr. Martinez made a note in the chart. "Good Samaritans sometimes prefer to remain anonymous. The important thing is that you're safe now." But Margaret found that the question of Samuel's identity had lodged itself in her mind, like a splinter. Throughout the morning, as nurses checked her vitals and Jennifer arrived with flowers and worried efficiency, Margaret kept returning to those moments in the car. The gentleness in Samuel's voice, the competence of his hands, the absolute certainty in his promise that she would be fine. "The Morrison people called," Jennifer reported, pulling files from her leather portfolio with the systematic precision that had made her indispensable over the past 8 years. "They're willing to postpone the signing until next week. I told them you were in a minor accident but would be ready to proceed." Margaret stared at her assistant's earnest face, 34 years old, unmarried, dedicated to Margaret's success with the fervor of someone who had hitched her wagon to a star. Jennifer lived for these moments, when crisis demanded her organizational skills and absolute loyalty. "Cancel the Morrison deal," Margaret said quietly. Jennifer's pen stopped moving across her notepad. "I'm sorry? Cancel it. Call Richards and tell him we're withdrawing our offer." "Margaret, you've been working on this acquisition for 8 months. The projections show." "I don't care about the projections." Margaret closed her eyes, seeing again Samuel's weathered face in the window of her destroyed car. "I need to find someone." Jennifer sat forward, her professional composure slipping slightly. "Find someone? Who?" "The man who pulled me out of the car. I need to know who he is." For the next hour, Jennifer applied her considerable administrative skills to the task of identifying Margaret's rescuer. She called the police department, the paramedic service, the hospital administration. She spoke with the tow truck driver, who had removed the Mercedes, and the cleanup crew, who had cleared the debris from the accident scene. No one had gotten a name. No one had seen where he went. The man who had saved Margaret Chen's life had vanished, as completely as if he had never existed. "There might be security cameras on the overpass," Jennifer suggested, but Margaret could see the doubt in her assistant's eyes. The area where the accident occurred was an industrial zone, poorly lit and rarely monitored. Samuel had appeared from the shadows and returned to them with equal ease. Emma arrived that afternoon, having driven down from Seattle the moment she heard about the accident. She burst into the hospital room with the dramatic flair Margaret remembered from her daughter's theatrical phases, her environmental nonprofit T-shirt wrinkled from the 6-hour drive. "Mom, what happened?" "Jennifer said you hit a truck?" "The truck hit me," Margaret corrected, though the distinction seemed less important now than it had that morning. "I'm fine. Minor injuries." Emma examined her mother's bandaged forehead and the cast on her left leg. Minor injuries. Right. You could have been killed. For the first time since the accident, Margaret felt the full weight of that possibility. Not the business implications or the logistical complications, but the simple fact that she could have died alone in a twisted car on a rainy night, with no one knowing where she was or how long she had been there. Someone found me, Margaret said. A man I'd never seen before. He stayed with me until the ambulance came. Emma pulled her chair closer to the bed. Did you get his name? Samuel. That's all I know. Margaret looked out the window at the city skyline, her corner office visible in the distance, like a monument to a life that suddenly felt very far away. I need to find him, Emma. I need to thank him properly. We'll find him, Emma said with the confidence of someone who believed that determination could overcome any obstacle. How hard can it be? Over the next 3 days, as Margaret's body began to heal, she discovered exactly how difficult it could be to find someone who existed in the invisible spaces of the city. The police report listed her rescuer as unidentified male, approximately 50 to 60 years old. The paramedics remembered him as cooperative but declined to provide contact information. The hospital had no record of his presence at all. Margaret's discharge papers arrived on Thursday morning, signed by Dr. Martinez and bearing the official stamp that marked her transition from patient back to functional member of society. But as Jennifer wheeled her toward the hospital exit, Margaret realized that something fundamental had changed during her stay. The papers in her hand represented more than medical clearance. They were permission to return to her old life, too. Reclaim her position on the 42nd floor, to resume the relentless pursuit of success that had defined her for decades. But the woman being wheeled through the hospital corridors was not the same person who had been extracted from the wreckage 4 days earlier. As the automatic doors opened and the city air hit her face, Margaret Chen made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her former self. Instead of returning to her corner office, instead of rescheduling the Morrison acquisition, instead of resuming the carefully ordered routine that had brought her wealth and status and isolation, she was going to find the man who had asked if she was okay. The discharge papers rustled in her lap as Jennifer helped her into the waiting car. Official documents that marked the end of her medical emergency, but the beginning of something far more complicated. A search for someone who might not want to be found. In a city full of people who had perfected the art of being invisible, as they drove through downtown, Margaret found herself looking at the sidewalks with new eyes, studying the faces of people she had never noticed before, searching for a weathered face and kind eyes that had given her something more valuable than medical attention. They had given her a reason to believe that strangers could still care about each other without expecting anything in return. Discharge papers in her hands might have declared her medically fit to return to her old life. But Margaret Chen was about to discover that some recoveries required more than healing bones and fading bruises. Some recoveries required finding the courage to step outside the glass towers and discover what was waiting at street level. Samuel's weathered notebook lay open on his lap as he sat in his usual spot in Meridian Park, the morning sun warming the pages where he documented the rhythms of street life. Today's entry began with careful observations about the changing weather and the first hints of spring in the city's concrete landscape. Thursday morning, he wrote in his methodical cursive. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that her daughter graduates nursing school next month. Tommy found work at the construction site on 5th Street temporary, but honest pay. Mary's sister sent money from El Salvador, enough for Mary to get her teeth fixed. Small victories that feel large when you live this close to the edge. Samuel had been keeping this journal for 3 years, ever since he realized that the stories of the invisible deserve preservation. The notebook contained more than daily observations. It held philosophy born from necessity, wisdom earned through loss, portraits of dignity maintained in impossible circumstances. He had no idea that 5 miles away, Margaret Chen was beginning Her own kind of documentation. Margaret's penthouse apartment felt different when she returned from the hospital. The same floor-to-ceiling windows offered the same commanding view of the city, but she found herself drawn to the glass for reasons that had nothing to do with surveying her corporate domain. Somewhere in the maze of streets below, Samuel was living his daily routine, unaware that the woman he had saved was searching for him. Jennifer had prepared a comprehensive plan for Margaret's rehabilitation period. As she called it, meetings were rescheduled, calls were redirected, and the Morrison acquisition was placed on indefinite hold, despite protests from the board of directors. But Margaret's rehabilitation had little to do with healing her broken leg and everything to do with finding one man in a city of 3 million people. "I've contacted every homeless shelter in the metropolitan area," Jennifer reported during their first post-hospital meeting. She spread printouts across Margaret's dining table with the same efficiency she brought to merge documents. 37 facilities total. None of them have a Samuel on their resident lists. Margaret studied the addresses, noting how many were located in neighborhoods she had never visited despite living in the city for 23 years. He might not be staying in shelters, and Samuel might not be his real name. That makes the search considerably more difficult. Jennifer's voice carried the frustration of someone accustomed to solving problems through systematic application of resources without more specific information. "I have more specific information." Margaret pulled out her own notebook, a leather-bound journal she had started the day she left the hospital. He had kind eyes, gray hair, neatly trimmed beard, well-spoken, gentle hands. He knew basic first aid and stayed calm in an emergency. Jennifer looked at the notebook with barely concealed concern. "Margaret, those descriptions could apply to thousands of men in the city. Then we start with thousands and narrow it down." Over the next week, Margaret began a methodical exploration of spaces she had never known existed. She visited soup kitchens in converted church basements, walked through parks where men slept on benches, and stood outside social services offices, watching faces that had become invisible to the rushing commuters around them. Each location taught her something new about the geography of need. The downtown mission served breakfast to over 200 people every morning, men and women of all ages, some clearly struggling with mental illness or addiction, others who looked like they could be bank managers or teachers who had simply run out of options. Margaret learned to distinguish between the recently homeless, who still carried themselves with the posture of people expecting their situation to be temporary, and the long-term street residents, who moved with the careful economy of those who understood that survival required constant vigilance at each stop. She asked about Samuel, describing him as carefully as she could. Most people listened politely and shook their heads. A few offered vague possibilities. "There's a Sam who comes to the Wednesday dinner, but he's younger, or used to be a Samuel at the shelter on MLK. But that was months ago." Margaret's notebook grew thick with addresses, phone numbers, and fragments of conversation. She discovered that the homeless community was both tightly knit and constantly shifting, with information traveling through networks of mutual aid and shared caution. People protected each other's privacy fiercely, having learned that visibility often brought unwanted attention from authorities or predators. "You seem different," Emma observed during one of their phone calls. "More focused, but also more scattered, if that makes sense." Margaret was standing at her living room window, looking down at the street with new eyes. "I'm learning about parts of the city I never knew existed. Because you're looking for this man?" "Because I'm looking for myself." The words surprised Margaret as she spoke them. "For 23 years, I've lived in this city and seen only the parts that related to business. I know every corporate boardroom downtown, but I had no idea there was a community of 200 people living in the park 6 blocks from my office." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Mom, are you sure this is healthy?" This obsession with finding Someone who might not want to be found. Margaret considered the question. Was it healthy to spend her days walking through parts of the city she had previously avoided? Was it normal to carry a notebook full of conversations with people whose names she was only beginning to learn? Was it wise to put her corporate responsibilities on hold to search for a man whose only known characteristic was kindness? I don't know if it's healthy, Margaret admitted, but it feels necessary. Samuel, meanwhile, continued his own routines, unaware of the search being conducted in his name. His days followed patterns established by years of careful observation and adaptation. Morning visits to check on the most vulnerable members of his community. Afternoon hours in the park, writing in his journal and offering quiet conversation to anyone who needed it. Evening rounds to ensure that elderly Jerry had taken his medication and that Lisa had found somewhere safe to sleep. His notebook entries during this period reflected a man settled into his role as an unofficial guardian of the forgotten. Friday evening. Helped Maria's son with his college application essay. The boy has real potential, but the system isn't designed for young men whose address changes weekly. Tommy's construction job lasted 3 days before they discovered he had no permanent address for their insurance forms. Mary found a part-time position cleaning offices, but she needs someone to vouch for her reliability. Small problems that become insurmountable without someone willing to guarantee your humanity. Samuel's writing revealed a philosophical bent that his circumstances had sharpened rather than dulled. He understood system failures from the bottom up, having experienced firsthand how bureaucratic requirements designed to ensure accountability often serve to exclude the most vulnerable. His journal contained not just observations but solutions, practical approaches to problems that the housed world rarely considered. As Margaret's search entered its second week, she began to understand why Samuel had been so difficult to find. The invisible population of the city moved through spaces that existed in the gaps between official recognition. They gathered in parks that weren't patrolled, slept in alcoves that weren't monitored, and survived through networks of mutual aid that operated entirely outside institutional frameworks. But Margaret's search was changing her as much as it was educating her. Each conversation with a shelter volunteer, each failed lead, each moment of standing in line for free meals while looking for Samuel was stripping away layers of assumption about how the world worked and who deserved attention. She began to recognize faces among the people she had once dismissed as part of the urban landscape. Tommy, who worked construction when he could find it. Maria, who sold newspapers with quiet dignity. Jerry, whose heart medication came from a prescription, shared by someone who understood that survival sometimes required bending rules. Margaret's notebook was filling with more than search information. It was becoming a record of her education in the realities that existed just the air-conditioned comfort of corporate success. Each page brought her closer to understanding not just where Samuel might be, but why finding him had become so important to her recovery from more than physical injuries. The weathered notebook in Samuel's hands and the leather journal in Margaret's both contained stories of human connection and dignity preserved against difficult odds. Without knowing it, they were both documenting the same city from different perspectives, their words drawing them toward an inevitable reunion that would transform both their understanding of what it meant to ask, "Are you okay?" The simple white takeout container in Margaret's hands felt heavier than the multi-million-dollar contracts she was accustomed to carrying. Inside were 2 turkey sandwiches, soup, and fruit cups, a modest meal that represented her first attempt at engaging with the homeless community as something more than an observer conducting a search. She stood outside the downtown Mission on a drizzly Tuesday morning, watching the line of people waiting for the doors to open. Margaret had spent 3 weeks searching for Samuel through official channels and careful inquiries, but her corporate approach to problem-solving had yielded nothing but dead ends and polite rejections. Now, She was trying a different strategy, becoming part of the community she was trying to understand. "First time?" asked the woman standing behind her in line. Margaret turned to see a face that might have been 40 or 60 street life had. A way of aging people beyond chronological calculation. The woman's name was Dorothy, and she carried herself with the precise dignity of someone who had learned to maintain standards in circumstances that offered no support for such things. "Yes," Margaret admitted, adjusting her grip on the food container. "I'm looking for someone." Dorothy nodded with the understanding of someone who had heard that story many times. "Lost touch with family? Not family. Someone who helped me. A man named Samuel. Samuel's a common name down here. What's he look like?" Margaret provided her now familiar description, adding details she had remembered during sleepless nights. The way Samuel had moved with economical precision, the gentleness in his voice, the competent way he had assessed her injuries and communicated with the emergency responders. Dorothy listened with the careful attention of someone accustomed to cataloging human details for survival purposes. "Sounds like Samuel Martinez. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's good people. Helps folks out when he can." Margaret's heart jumped. "You know him, ma'am?" "Know of him. He doesn't come to the mission much, has his own arrangements. But word gets around about the decent ones." Dorothy studied Margaret's expensive clothes and carefully maintained appearance. "You sure you're looking for the right reasons?" The question caught Margaret off guard. "What do you mean?" "Some folks come looking for homeless people because they want to feel good about themselves. Hand out some food, take some pictures, right? Some checks. Makes them feel charitable without actually changing anything." Dorothy's voice held no accusation, just a weary observation of someone who had seen good intentions turn into exploitation. Margaret considered the question seriously. Was she searching for Samuel to make herself feel better? To discharge some imagined debt? To prove something about her own character? "I don't know," she said finally. "I know he saved my life, and I know I can't stop thinking about the way he asked if I was okay. Like he actually cared about the answer." Dorothy's expression softened slightly. "That sounds like Samuel. Man's got a way of making you feel seen, even when the rest of the world looks right through you." As they moved through the line and into the mission's dining hall, Dorothy provided Margaret with her first real education in the social dynamics of street life. The homeless community had its own hierarchies, its own codes of conduct, its own systems of mutual support and protection. Samuel, according to Dorothy, occupied a respected position in these informal networks. Not a leader, exactly, but someone whose judgment people trusted and whose help came without conditions or judgment. "He used to have money," Dorothy said, as they found seats at a long table. "You can tell by the way he carries himself. But whatever happened, it didn't make him bitter. Some people, they lose everything and they want to drag everyone else down with them. Samuel's different. He tries to lift people up." Margaret spent the next 2 hours listening to stories about Samuel's quiet interventions, how he had talked Tommy out of a dangerous confrontation with police, how he had helped Maria navigate the bureaucracy to get her son enrolled in community college, how he had shared his heart medication with Jerry when the old man's prescription ran out. These stories painted a picture of a man who had transformed personal loss into community service, who had found ways to maintain dignity and purpose, despite circumstances that would have crushed many people. Margaret began to understand why Samuel had been so difficult to find through official channels. He existed in the spaces between institutions, providing services that no government agency or nonprofit organization could offer. After the meal, Dorothy walked Margaret through the neighborhood, pointing out the invisible infrastructure of street life. The library branch that allowed people to use computers and bathrooms without harassment. The laundromat where you could wash clothes if you bought a cup of coffee from the machine. The 24-hour diner where the night manager looked the Other way when people nursed a single cup of coffee for hours. Samuel usually spends mornings in Meridian Park, Dorothy said as they walked. Has a spot near the fountain where he does his writing. Afternoons, he makes rounds checking on people, seeing who needs what. Evenings, he's usually at the bridge, helping folks settle in for the night. Margaret pulled out her notebook and wrote down the locations, but Dorothy put a gentle hand on her arm. Don't hunt him down like he owes you something, Dorothy said. If you want to find Samuel, the best way is to become part of the community he serves. Start showing up to help, not to search. He'll notice you eventually, and when he's ready, he'll make contact. Margaret looked at her notebook pages filled with addresses, phone numbers, and descriptions and realized that all her systematic searching had been approaching the problem backwards. She had been trying to locate Samuel as if he were a lost asset to be recovered, when what she needed to do was understand the world he had chosen to inhabit. Over the next week, Margaret began following Dorothy's advice. Instead of conducting interviews and making inquiries, she started showing up. She brought food to the park and stayed to share meals with whoever was hungry. She volunteered at the mission, learning to serve soup and sort donations. She spent afternoons at the library, helping people fill out job applications and navigate social services websites. Slowly, Margaret began to understand the rhythms of this powerless city that existed within her familiar corporate landscape. She learned that survival required both individual resilience and community support. That dignity was something you maintained rather than something others granted you. And that kindness was a currency that could be shared freely without being diminished. Her notebook evolved from a search log to a record of relationships and observations. She wrote about conversations with Maria about her son's college prospects, about Tommy's frustrations with employment systems that required permanent addresses, about Jerry's stories from his decades working in the city's now-closed factories, the simple takeout containers that had started as props in her search became genuine offerings of connection. Margaret discovered that sharing a meal was a form of communication that transcended the economic barriers that had previously defined her interactions with other people. When you handed someone a sandwich, you were acknowledging their humanity in the most basic way possible. As Margaret's understanding of the community deepened, she began to see traces of Samuel's influence everywhere. People mentioned his advice, quoted his observations, relied on systems of mutual aid that he had helped establish. He seemed to exist as a kind of philosophical center for a group of people who had been abandoned by most social institutions. 3 weeks into her new routine, as Margaret sat in Meridian Park sharing lunch with a group of regulars, Dorothy nodded toward a man walking across the grass with a weathered notebook under his arm. "There's your Samuel," Dorothy said quietly. Margaret looked up and felt her breath catch. Even from a distance, she recognized the careful way he moved, the neat appearance he maintained despite his circumstances, the quiet attention he paid to the people around him. Samuel Martinez was 50 yards away, settling onto a bench in the morning sun, opening his notebook to write. Margaret started to stand, then stopped herself. Dorothy's advice echoed in her mind. Don't hunt him down like he owes you something. Instead, she watched as Samuel wrote in his journal, occasionally looking up to nod at people passing by, existing peacefully in the community he had helped to build. For the first time since the accident, Margaret felt no urgency to approach, no need to force a reunion. Samuel was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. And Margaret was beginning to understand that finding him had been less important than finding the world he inhabited and the person she might become within it. The takeout container in her hands was empty now, but her notebook was full of stories about kindness and dignity and the ways people took care of each other when nobody else would. Margaret Chen, CEO, had been searching for Samuel Martinez, homeless man, but Margaret Chen, human being, had found something much more valuable, a community that measured worth by character rather than bank accounts, and a version of herself that she was only beginning to recognize. The faded photograph trembled in Samuel's weathered hands as he sat on his bench in Meridian Park, the morning light catching the edges of the image like a blessing. It showed a younger version of himself in a navy suit, standing beside a woman in a blue dress and two children with gap-toothed smiles. The photo had survived 5 years of street life, protected in a plastic sandwich bag that he kept in the deepest pocket of his backpack. Samuel studied the faces in the photograph, his wife Elena, his daughter Sophia, his son David, and tried to remember what it felt like to be the man who had earned enough money to buy that suit, to live in the house visible in the background, to believe that success was something you could build and keep. "Morning, Samuel," Dorothy called as she approached with a woman Samuel had been noticing around the community for several weeks. The newcomer was clearly out of her element, expensive clothes, carefully chosen to look casual, movements that spoke of someone unaccustomed to navigating unpredictable spaces, but a genuine attention to the people around her that had earned respect from the regulars. "Morning, Dorothy," Samuel replied, slipping the photograph back into its protective bag. "How are you today?" "Better for the company," Dorothy said, settling onto the bench beside him. "Samuel, I'd like you to meet Margaret. She's been helping out at the mission, learning her way around the community." Samuel looked up at the woman Dorothy had brought, and something shifted in his chest like a door opening in a room he had thought was sealed. He had seen this face before, but not here, not in this context. The memory was elusive, wrapped in the confusion of emergency and adrenaline, but the recognition was undeniable. Margaret stared down at Samuel with an expression that moved through surprise, relief, and something deeper, a kind of completion, as if a puzzle she had been working on for months had finally revealed its solution. "It's you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel stood slowly, his notebook falling forgotten to the bench. "The car accident," he said. "You were trapped in the Mercedes." "I asked if you were okay," Margaret finished. "You asked if I was okay." Dorothy looked between them with growing understanding. "Well, I'll be damned. The woman who's been looking for you is the woman you saved." Samuel studied Margaret's face. The silver hair that had been matted with blood was now neatly styled. The expensive suit had been replaced by jeans and a simple sweater, but the eyes were the same ones that had looked at him with such trust and gratitude in those terrifying moments beside the wreckage. "I've been searching for you for 2 months," Margaret said. "I wanted to thank you, but also to understand." She paused, struggling to find words for something she had only begun to understand herself. "You appeared out of nowhere to help a complete stranger, and then you disappeared just as completely. I needed to know who you were." Samuel gestured for her to sit on the bench, and Dorothy excused herself with the tactful wisdom of someone who understood when two people needed privacy to navigate their own conversation. "I'm not sure I'm anyone worth searching for," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had spent years being invisible. "I was just walking by when I heard the crash." "Anyone would have done the same thing." Margaret shook her head firmly. "No, they wouldn't have. I've learned enough about this city in the past 2 months to know that most people would have kept walking. You stayed with me until help arrived. You kept me conscious and calm. You probably saved my life." Samuel picked up his notebook, running his fingers along the worn cover. "I've learned that helping people is one of the few things that make sense when everything else falls apart." Margaret looked at the notebook with curiosity. "You write observations, stories about the people down here, thoughts about how things work and how they could work better." Samuel opened the journal to a random page, revealing neat handwriting that filled every line. 5 years of watching people survive things that should have killed them and thrive in situations that would break most folks. There's wisdom in these streets that the folks in the towers never see. Margaret felt something catch in her chest. As she listened to Samuel talk about the community she had been learning to navigate. 5 years? How long have you been? She stopped herself, realizing the question might be too personal. Homeless? Samuel supplied without offense. 5 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that I'm counting. He smiled with the rueful humor of someone who had learned to find lightness in dark circumstances. Margaret opened her own notebook, the leather-bound journal that had become her record of the past 2 months. I've been writing, too, about the people I've met while looking for you, about learning to see parts of the city I never knew existed. Samuel read a few lines over her shoulder, observations about Dorothy's quiet leadership, notes about Maria's fierce protection of her son's future, reflections on the dignity that people maintained despite circumstances that offered no support for such things. You're learning to see what was always there, Samuel said. Most people look at homeless folks and see failure, addiction, mental illness, all the reasons someone might end up on the streets. But they don't see the strength it takes to survive here, the creativity required to solve problems without resources, the community that forms when people take care of each other because no one else will. Margaret studied Samuel's face as he spoke, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the measured way he chose his words, the obvious education that had somehow led him to this bench in this park. What did you do before? She asked gently. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, looking at the photograph in his hands. I was a systems analyst for a technology consulting firm. 15 years with the same company, working my way up from entry level to senior management. I had a house in the suburbs, 2 cars, a retirement account. I thought I understood how the world worked. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. Which company? Samuel looked at her with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read faces for survival information. Chen Technologies, he said quietly. I worked for Margaret Chen. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to find. Margaret stared at Samuel, her mind racing through the implications of what he had just revealed. The man who had saved her life had once worked for her company. The homeless man she had been searching for had once been her employee. When? She asked, though she was afraid of the answer. I was laid off in the restructuring of 2019, Samuel said, his voice neutral but his eyes watchful. The company was acquired by Meridian Corp, and they eliminated my entire department. 230 people lost their jobs that day. Margaret remembered the acquisition clearly. It had been hailed as a strategic victory, a way to eliminate redundancy and improve efficiency. She had signed the termination papers herself, approving the elimination of positions that the consultants had identified as unnecessary overlap. I remember that acquisition, she said quietly. I signed off on the workforce reduction. Samuel nodded. I figured you might have. It wasn't personal, just business, like they said in the meetings. But when you're 52 years old and you've been out of work for 6 months, personal and business start to look pretty much the same. Margaret closed her notebook, her hand shaking slightly. What happened after the layoff? Samuel's voice took on the flat tone of someone reciting facts that had been worn smooth by repetition. Unemployment benefits lasted 6 months. Savings lasted another 8 months. The house went into foreclosure after a year. Alana, my wife, she tried to stick with me, but the stress was too much. She took the kids and moved back to her parents in Arizona. Divorce was finalized 2 years ago. Margaret felt each word like a physical blow. The photograph in Samuel's hands wasn't just a memento. It was evidence of a life that had been systematically dismantled by decisions she had made from the comfort of her corner office. Samuel, she began, but he held up a gentle hand. Not telling you this to make you feel guilty, he said. What happened to me happened to thousands of people during that recession. Companies had to make hard choices, and most of the people making those choices never saw the faces of the folks who got hurt. Margaret looked around the park, seeing the community Samuel had found and helped build, understanding now why he had been so difficult to locate through official channels. He had fallen through every safety net the system was supposed to provide, and he had survived by creating his own networks of mutual aid and support. "But you saved me," Margaret said, the irony of it almost too large to comprehend. "After everything I took from you, you still saved my life." Samuel smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face. "That's the thing about being down here. You learn that helping people isn't about what they deserve or what they've done to you. It's about what kind of person you want to be when someone needs help." Margaret stared at the faded photograph in Samuel's hands, understanding now that it represented more than a lost family. It represented the human cost of business decisions that had seemed abstract and necessary from 42 floors above the street. The man who had asked if she was okay had every reason to hate her, but instead he had risked his own safety to pull her from a burning car. The recognition hanging between them wasn't just about remembering each other. It was about understanding how their lives had intersected in ways neither of them had realized, and how that intersection had led them both to this bench, this moment, this unexpected opportunity for something that looked remarkably like redemption. The medical alert bracelet on Samuel's wrist caught the afternoon light as he reached for his coffee cup, and Margaret found herself staring at the simple piece of metal that had somehow escaped her notice during all their previous encounters. The inscription was barely visible from her angle, but something about the way Samuel unconsciously adjusted it made her lean closer. "Samuel," she said carefully, "what does your bracelet say?" Samuel looked down at his wrist with surprise, as if he had forgotten he was wearing it. "Just medical information. I have a heart condition, nothing dramatic, but the paramedics need to know about my medications if something happens." Margaret felt a strange buzzing in her ears, the same sensation she had experienced in the moments before losing consciousness in the car. "Can I see it?" Samuel extended his arm across the table, and Margaret read the engraved text with growing disbelief. Samuel Martinez. Heart condition, diabetes, emergency contact, Chen Technologies Employee Services, 555 847 290. Oh, the phone number hit Margaret like a physical blow. It was her company's old employee assistance line, discontinued 3 years ago, but apparently never updated on Samuel's medical information. But it was more than just an outdated phone number that made Margaret's world tilt sideways. It was the sudden, crystalline memory of a conversation she had tried to forget. "You kept the company emergency contact," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel nodded. "Never got around to changing it. Seemed pointless when I didn't have anyone else to list." Margaret closed her eyes, and suddenly she was back in her corner office in March 2019, sitting across from her head of human resources as they reviewed a list of employees who would be terminated in the Meridian acquisition. She remembered her HR director mentioning complications with several of the layoff's employees who had medical conditions, family situations, or other factors that might require additional severance consideration. There was one employee, Margaret said slowly, who came to the office after his termination. He wanted to speak with me directly about his severance package. Security had to escort him out. Samuel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. That was me. Margaret felt the memory rushing back with painful clarity. Samuel had appeared at her office 3 days after receiving his termination notice, asking to speak with her about his situation. He had mentioned his wife's medical bills, his daughter's college tuition, his own heart condition that made finding new employment with health insurance critical. Margaret's assistant had scheduled him for 15 minutes, but Margaret had been running late from another meeting. "You waited for 2 hours," Margaret said, the shame of the memory making her voice thick. Jennifer kept apologizing, telling you I was in back-to-back meetings. But I wasn't, was I? Samuel's silence confirmed what Margaret already knew. She had been in her office, visible through the glass walls, taking phone calls and reviewing documents while Samuel sat in the waiting area with his termination papers and his desperate hope that a personal appeal might change his circumstances. I was avoiding you, Margaret admitted. Jennifer told me you wanted to discuss your severance, and I instructed her to refer you to human resources. I didn't want to have that conversation. I know, Samuel said quietly. I could see you through the glass. I watched you make phone calls, answer emails, do everything except acknowledge that I was there. Margaret remembered the rest of the story, now how her security director had eventually approached Samuel, explaining that CEO meetings required advanced scheduling through proper channels. How Samuel had asked one more time to speak with her, just for 5 minutes. How she had watched from her office as 2 security guards escorted him to the elevator, his dignity intact but his hope visibly diminished. After they walked you out, Margaret said, I told Jennifer to flag your file. No further meetings, no exceptions. I was afraid you might become one of those disgruntled employees who... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Might cause trouble, Samuel completed. I understand. From your perspective, I was a potential liability. A terminated employee who wouldn't accept the decision and move on. Margaret looked at the bracelet again, seeing now not just outdated contact information, but evidence of a man who had still believed, even after losing his job, that the company he had served for 15 years might help him in an emergency. The cruel irony was almost too much to bear. The emergency contact he had listed was the woman who had refused to see him when he needed help most. What were you going to ask me? Margaret said. In that meeting I wouldn't give you? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, looking at the faded photograph of his family. I was going to ask for 6 additional months of health insurance. Elena was undergoing treatment for breast cancer, and our COBRA payments were going to be $800 a month. I had already started looking for work, but I needed time to find something with comparable benefits. Margaret felt something break open in her chest. Elena's cancer treatment, of course. That's why Samuel had been so desperate to speak with her, why he had waited for 2 hours in her reception area, why he had risked the humiliation of being escorted out by security. How is Elena now? Margaret asked, though she was afraid of the answer. She beat the cancer, Samuel said, and for the first time since their conversation began, his voice carried notes of joy. She's been in remission for 3 years. But medical bills, he shrugged. That's what finished us financially. Even after she recovered, we were so far behind on everything that bankruptcy was inevitable. Margaret understood now the true weight of her decision to avoid that 15-minute meeting. If she had granted Samuel's request, if she had approved extended health coverage for a long-time employee facing a family medical crisis, Elena's treatment might not have driven them into financial ruin. Samuel might have found new employment without the pressure of mounting medical debt. His family might have survived intact. I could have prevented all of this, Margaret said, her voice barely audible. Samuel shook his head firmly. No, you couldn't have. My situation was complicated long before I lost that job. Elena's illness, the recession, the housing market collapse, a lot of things had to go wrong for me to end up here. Your decision was just one factor. But Margaret wasn't consoled by his generous interpretation. She remembered the afternoon clearly now, how she had been annoyed by Samuel's persistence, how she had seen his request for a meeting as an attempt to circumvent proper channels, how she had instructed security to handle the situation because she didn't want to deal with what she had characterized as an emotional former employee. I was wrong, Margaret said. I was wrong about you, wrong about the situation, wrong about what it meant to be responsible for people's livelihoods. I treated you like a potential problem instead of a human being who had served the company faithfully for 15 years. Samuel reached across the table and gently touched Margaret's hand. You were protecting yourself and your company. I understand that now. But understanding doesn't change what happened. Margaret looked at Samuel's weathered notebook, thinking about the wisdom he had accumulated during 5 years of street life, the community he had helped build, the quiet dignity with which he had transformed personal disaster into service to others. Then she looked at her own leather journal. One leather journal was even to you. Then she looked at her own leather filled with observations about people whose struggles she was only beginning to comprehend. The bracelet, she said suddenly. You've been wearing our company contact information for 5 years, even after everything that happened. Why? Samuel smiled with the sad wisdom of someone who had learned to find meaning in irony. Because hope is a hard habit to break. Even after Elena left, even after I lost the house, even after I ended up here, part of me still believed that the people I had worked with for 15 years might care what happened to me. Margaret stared at the medical alert bracelet, understanding now that it represented more than outdated emergency information. It was evidence of loyalty that had survived betrayal, hope that had persisted through abandonment, faith in human connection that had endured despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Samuel, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions, threatening to overwhelm her. I want to make this right. Samuel's expression grew cautious. What do you mean? Margaret pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts until she found the number she needed. I mean, I want to give you that meeting I should have granted 5 years ago. I want to listen to what you needed then, and I want to figure out what you need now. Samuel watched as Margaret composed a text message, his weathered face showing the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust sudden offers of redemption. Margaret, he said gently, I'm not the same person who needed that meeting 5 years ago, and you're not the same person who refused to grant it. We can undo the past. Margaret looked up from her phone, meeting Samuel's eyes with an intensity that reminded him of the woman who had built a business empire through sheer force of will. No, she said, we can undo the past, but we can choose what we do with the future, and I choose to start by keeping a promise I should have made 5 years ago. The medical alert bracelet caught the light again as Samuel adjusted it on his wrist, but now Margaret saw it differently. It wasn't just evidence of outdated contact information. It was a bridge between the woman she had been and the person she was becoming, between the executive who had made decisions without seeing their human cost and the person who was finally ready to look directly at the consequences of her choices. The recognition hanging between them was complete now, encompassing not just the accident that had brought them together, but the years of separation that had brought them to this moment. Samuel Martinez had saved Margaret Chen's life on a rainy night, but Margaret Chen had destroyed Samuel Martinez's life years before she ever knew his name. Now they sat across from each other in a community center, both carrying notebooks full of hard-won wisdom, both understanding that redemption was possible but never guaranteed, both ready to discover what it might mean to truly answer the question, are you okay? The partnership agreement Margaret was drafting bore no resemblance to any contract she had written in 23 years of corporate law. There were no liability clauses, no termination procedures, no performance metrics measured in quarterly returns. Instead, the document outlined a collaboration based on principles she was still learning to articulate: mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the revolutionary idea that success could be measured in lives changed rather than profits earned. Margaret sat at her dining room table, surrounded by notebooks, financial statements, and research about homeless services in the metropolitan area. The view from her penthouse window still encompassed the same corporate landscape, But she found herself looking down at the streets where Samuel was conducting his evening rounds, checking on the community members who had become her teachers. Over the past 3 months, Emma arrived that evening with takeout containers and the patient expression of someone prepared to listen to her mother's latest transformation. "You're really going to do this," Emma said, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "You're going to walk away from Chen Technologies to start a homeless advocacy organization with the man who used to work for you." Margaret looked up from her papers. "I'm going to try to make amends for decisions I made without understanding their consequences. Samuel has agreed to help, but he's understandably cautious about trusting me with anything important." Emma examined the documents spread across the table: budgets for transitional housing, proposals for job training programs, letters of inquiry to potential foundation partners. "Mom, this is a complete career change. Are you sure you're thinking clearly?" Margaret had been asking herself the same question for weeks. Was her desire to help Samuel and his community genuine advocacy, or was it elaborate guilt management? Was she capable of working effectively with people whose experiences she was only beginning to understand? Was she prepared to give up the financial security and social status that had defined her identity for decades? "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Margaret said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "For 23 years, I made decisions that affected thousands of people, but I never had to see the results. I lived in boardrooms and corner offices, dealing with abstractions, workforce reductions, efficiency improvements, strategic realignments. Samuel showed me what those abstractions look like when they land on actual human beings." Emma picked up one of Margaret's notebooks, reading entries about Tommy's job search struggles, Maria's determination to get her son through college, Jerry's daily battle with heart medication that costs more than his monthly income. "These people have become real to you," Emma observed. "More real than most of the executives I've worked with for years," Margaret admitted. "When Tommy can't find work because he doesn't have a permanent address, that's a solvable problem. But nobody's trying to solve it because homeless people don't have political influence or economic power. They're invisible until they become inconvenient." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Samuel. "Community meeting tonight, 7 p.m. at the shelter. Can you make it?" She had been attending these gatherings for 6 weeks, learning to listen rather than speak, to follow rather than lead. The meetings were Samuel's innovation, a weekly forum where homeless community members could share information, coordinate resources, and address conflicts before they escalated into crises. "I have to go," Margaret told Emma. "Samuel's called a community meeting, and there's apparently some kind of crisis brewing." Emma looked at her mother with the mixture of pride and concern that had characterized their relationship since Margaret's accident. "What kind of crisis?" Margaret gathered her notebooks and pulled on the practical jacket she had learned to wear for evening activities in less secure neighborhoods. "The city council is considering an ordinance that would make it illegal to sleep in public spaces. If it passes, it would effectively criminalize being homeless in the city." Emma followed her mother to the door. "What can you do about it?" Margaret paused, keys in hand. "I don't know yet, but Samuel has ideas, and I'm learning to trust his judgment about how to navigate problems I never knew existed." The community meeting was held in the basement of St. Mark's Methodist Church, a space that managed to feel both institutional and welcoming. Margaret had learned that these gatherings operated according to rules that had evolved organically. Everyone had a voice, conflicts were addressed directly but respectfully, and decisions were made by consensus rather than authority. Samuel stood at the front of the room, but his posture suggested facilitation rather than leadership. Behind him, a hand-drawn chart outlined the proposed ordinance and its potential consequences for the 63 people who regularly attended these meetings. "The city council meets Thursday," Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly through the basement. They're going to vote on Proposition 847, which would make it a misdemeanor to sleep, sit, or lie down in any public space between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. Margaret looked around the room at faces she had come to know over the past months. Dorothy, who managed information networks with the efficiency of a corporate communications director. Tommy, whose construction skills were constantly in demand but whose lack of permanent address made steady employment impossible. Maria, who worked 2 part-time jobs while advocating fiercely for her son's educational opportunities. What they're really voting on, Dorothy said from her seat in the front row, is whether being poor is going to be a criminal offense in this city. Samuel nodded. The ordinance is being presented as a public safety measure, but we all know what it really is, way to make us disappear without actually addressing the reasons we're here. Margaret raised her hand, still learning the etiquette of these gatherings. What kind of opposition is the ordinance facing? Minimal, Samuel replied. 3 advocacy organizations have registered formal objections, but they don't have much political influence. The city council is responding to pressure from business groups who want the downtown area cleaned up for tourism and development. Margaret felt something familiar stirring in her chest, the strategic thinking that had made her successful in corporate boardrooms. But this time, instead of analyzing market opportunities, she was considering how to mobilize political resistance to protect people who had no traditional forms of power. What would it take to defeat this ordinance? She asked. Samuel consulted his notebook. Public pressure, media attention, testimony from affected community members, political allies who understand that criminalizing poverty doesn't reduce poverty. Margaret looked around the room at the faces of people who had taught her about dignity, resilience, and community. These were the individuals who would be most affected by the proposed ordinance, but they were also the people with the least access to traditional political processes. I might be able to help with that, Margaret said quietly. Samuel's expression was cautious. What did you have in mind? Margaret stood up, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. I still have contacts in the business community, relationships with media outlets, connections to people who have political influence. I've been learning to see the city from your perspective, but I haven't forgotten how to navigate the world I used to inhabit. Dorothy leaned forward in her chair. You're talking about using your corporate connections to fight against corporate interests? I'm talking about using whatever influence I have to protect people who matter to me, Margaret replied. The question is whether you trust me enough to let me try. The room fell silent as community members exchanged glances. Margaret understood that her offer represented a risk for people who had learned to be suspicious of help that came with hidden costs. She was asking them to let her fight on their behalf, but she was also asking them to believe that her motivations were genuine. Samuel looked at Margaret for a long moment, then addressed the room. Margaret has been part of our community for 3 months. She's shown up consistently, listened more than she's talked, and contributed without expecting recognition. I think we should hear what she has in mind. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened her contacts list. I can arrange meetings with city council members, organize opposition from business leaders who understand that criminalizing homelessness is bad policy, and coordinate media coverage that puts human faces on this issue. But I can't do any of that without your involvement. This has to be your campaign, with your voices at the center. Tommy raised his hand from the back of the room. What's the catch? Rich people don't usually fight against other rich people without getting something in return. Margaret met his gaze directly. The catch is that I'm asking you to trust someone who represents the same system that failed you. I understand why. That's difficult. Maria spoke up from the middle of the room. What makes you think your old friends will listen to you about homeless people? Most of them probably supported this ordinance. Some of them did, Margaret admitted. But business leaders respond to practical arguments. I can make the case that criminalizing homelessness is expensive, ineffective, and bad for the city's reputation. More importantly, I can arrange for you to make that case directly to the people who need to hear it. Samuel consulted his notebook again. We have 4 days until the vote. What's your timeline? Margaret had already been running calculations. In her head, tomorrow morning, I start making calls to city council members. I arrange meetings for Wednesday so community members can testify about how this ordinance would affect them. I reach out to media contacts for coverage Wednesday night and Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, we either have enough political pressure to defeat this thing, or we don't. Dorothy crossed her arms. And if we don't? Then we figure out. Next steps together, Margaret said. This ordinance is just one battle. The larger fight is about changing how this city treats people who don't have permanent addresses. That's going to take months or years, not days. Samuel closed his notebook and looked around the room. All in favor of letting Margaret coordinate political opposition to Proposition 847. Hands went up slowly around the room, not universal support, but a clear majority. Margaret felt the weight of their trust like a physical presence in her chest. All right, Samuel said. Margaret, you have our authorization to speak on behalf of this community. But understand that if you make promises we can't keep, or if this goes badly, the consequences fall on us, not you. Margaret nodded, understanding that Samuel was giving her both an opportunity and a warning. She was being allowed to use her privilege and connections in service of people who had none, but she was also being held accountable for the results. As the meeting dispersed, Samuel approached Margaret with the partnership agreement she had been drafting. I've been thinking about your proposal, he said, holding up the document. This collaboration you want to formalize between us. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. And? I think it could work, but only if we're honest about what we're each bringing to it. You have money, connections, and experience navigating institutional power. I have knowledge of this community and credibility with people who have good reasons not to trust outsiders. Margaret looked at the agreement pages of carefully crafted language that attempted to codify a partnership between two people whose lives had intersected in extraordinary ways. What are you saying? Samuel smiled. I'm saying that if you can help us defeat this ordinance, I'll sign your partnership agreement. But I want to add one clause. Margaret waited. If at any point the work we're doing starts serving your needs more than the community's needs, I walk away. No explanations, no negotiations. I just walk away. Margaret studied Samuel's face, seeing in it the wariness of someone who had learned that good intentions could become self-serving without the people involved realizing it had happened. Deal, she said, extending her hand. Samuel shook it firmly. Then let's go save some people from becoming criminals for the crime of having nowhere to sleep. As Margaret walked back to her penthouse that night, she understood that the partnership agreement in her briefcase represented more than a collaboration between two individuals. It was a contract between two different versions of herself, the executive who had made decisions without seeing their human consequences, and the advocate who was learning to measure success by the lives she could help rather than the profits she could generate. The city council vote was 4 days away. Margaret had 96 hours to use everything she had learned about power, persuasion, and political maneuvering to protect the community that had taught her what those things were really for. The partnership agreement would formalize her commitment. But the real test would come when she had to choose between the comfortable world she was leaving behind and the uncertain future she was trying to build. Samuel's weathered notebook contained 5 years of observations about survival and dignity. Margaret's leather journal held 3 months of education about community and connection. Together, they were about to discover whether two people from opposite sides of the economic divide could create something powerful enough to change the laws that governed both their lives. The resignation letter sat on Margaret's desk like a declaration of war against everything she had built over the past 23 years. 3 paragraphs of formal language that would dissolve her connection to Chen Technologies, forfeit her stake in the Morrison acquisition, and transform her from CEO to advocate in the space of a signature. Margaret Chen hereby submits her resignation from the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. She will retain her equity position, but will no longer participate in operational decisions or strategic planning. Margaret stared at the words, understanding that signing this document would be the most expensive decision of her career, and potentially the most important. Her phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. with calls from board members who had heard rumors about her involvement in opposing Proposition 847. Richard Morrison himself had called twice, threatening to withdraw from the acquisition if Margaret continued what he called her homeless advocacy nonsense. Jennifer sat across from Margaret's desk, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of strain. In 8 years as Margaret's assistant, she had navigated corporate crises, hostile takeovers, and regulatory investigations, but she had never been asked to schedule her boss's professional suicide. The board meeting is in 30 minutes. Jennifer sighed, checking her tablet. They're expecting you to explain your recent behavior and provide assurances about your commitment to the Morrison deal. Margaret looked out her corner office window at the city below, her eyes automatically finding the neighborhoods where Samuel was spending his morning checking on community members and coordinating their testimony for the city council session. That afternoon, what if I don't give them those assurances? Margaret asked. Jennifer's professional mask slipped entirely. Margaret, you built this company from nothing. You've spent 2 decades creating something that employs over 3,000 people and generates billions in revenue. Are you really going to throw that away for... She stopped herself. For what, Jennifer? Jennifer looked uncomfortable. For people who don't contribute anything to society. For a population that most of your clients and investors see as a problem, to be managed, not a cause to be championed. Margaret felt something settle in her chest, like a key finding its lock. Jennifer's words crystallized the choice she was facing, not just between her corporate life and her advocacy work, but between 2 fundamentally different definitions of what it meant to be successful. Samuel Martinez contributed to society. For 15 years, Margaret said quietly. He raised 2 children, supported his wife through cancer treatment, and helped build the technology systems that made this company profitable. Then I signed a piece of paper that eliminated his job, and society decided he had no value. Jennifer pulled up files on her tablet. Margaret, the workforce reduction in 2019 was necessary for the Meridian acquisition. The consultants identified human beings whose lives became inconvenient for our profit margins. Margaret interrupted. Samuel was one of 230 people we declared expendable, and I never bothered to learn. What happened to any of them afterward? Margaret stood up and walked to her window, looking down at the streets where some of those 230 people might still be struggling with the consequences of decisions she had made from this air-conditioned height. I'm resigning. Jennifer's tablet clattered to the floor. Margaret, you can't be serious. I'm serious. Margaret returned to her desk and signed the resignation letter with the same Mont-Blanc pen she had used to sign the termination orders 5 years earlier. I'm going to walk into that boardroom and tell them that I'm stepping down to pursue other interests. Jennifer stared at the signed document. What other interests? Running a homeless shelter? Becoming a social worker? Margaret, you're 52 years old. This is career suicide. Margaret folded the resignation letter and placed it in an envelope addressed to the board of directors. Maybe it's the first honest decision I've made in years. The boardroom felt different when Margaret entered for what she knew would be her final meeting as CEO. The same mahogany table, the same floor-to-ceiling windows, the same faces that had supported her through 2 decades of growth and expansion. But Margaret found herself seeing the room through different eyes, not as the seat of power she had fought to occupy, but as a fortress that had protected her from understanding the consequences of her decisions. Richard Morrison sat at the far end of the table, his expression making clear that he viewed Margaret's recent activities as a personal betrayal. The other board members maintained carefully neutral expressions, but Margaret could read the concern in their body language. "Margaret," said Board Chairman William Hayes, "we need to discuss your involvement in this homeless advocacy campaign. Several of our major clients have expressed concern about Chen Technologies' association with I'm resigning," Margaret said, placing the envelope on the table. The silence that followed was complete. Margaret had participated in hundreds of board meetings over the years, but she had never experienced this quality of absolute quiet. Morrison spoke first. "What do you mean, resigning?" "I mean I'm stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. David Chen can serve as interim CEO while you search for my replacement." Hayes opened the envelope and read the resignation letter quickly. "Margaret, this is highly irregular. You can't just abandon your responsibilities because you've developed some kind of conscience," Margaret suggested. Morrison leaned forward. "Margaret, I don't know what's happened to you since your accident, but you're making a serious mistake. This homeless advocacy crusade is going to destroy your reputation and accomplish nothing meaningful. These people you're trying to help, they're in their situation because of choices they made." Margaret looked at Morrison's face, the confidence of someone who had never been forced to choose between rent and medicine, the certainty of someone who believed that success was always earned and failure was always deserved. "Samuel Martinez made the choice to work for this company for 15 years, Margaret said. "He made the choice to be loyal, productive, and dedicated. I made the choice to eliminate his position to improve our profit margins. Which one of us bears responsibility for what happened to him afterward?" Board member Sarah Kim cleared her throat. "Margaret, even if you feel some personal responsibility for this man's situation, that doesn't justify abandoning your fiduciary duties to the company and our shareholders." Margaret understood that she was speaking a language her former colleagues could no longer comprehend. They heard her talking about homeless advocacy and heard only sentiment overriding sound business judgment. They couldn't see that she was talking about accountability, about the moral weight of decisions that affected human lives, about the possibility of using power for something other than accumulating more power. "I'm not abandoning my responsibilities," Margaret said. "I'm finally accepting them." She stood up, leaving the resignation letter on the mahogany table like a bridge she was burning behind her. "The Morrison acquisition documents are in my office safe. The quarterly projections are complete. Jennifer has been briefed on all pending matters. The transition should be seamless." Morrison stood as well, his face flushed with anger. "Margaret, if you walk out of this room, if you choose these homeless people over the business relationship we've been building, the Morrison deal is dead. You understand that?" Margaret looked at Morrison, seeing in his face the reflection of who she had been 6 months earlier, someone who believed that business relationships were more important than human relationships, that profit was more valuable than purpose, that success was measured by what you accumulated rather than what you contributed. "I understand perfectly," Margaret said as she walked toward the door. Hayes called after her. "Margaret, there's no coming back from this. If you leave now, if you choose this path, you'll be giving up everything you've worked for." Margaret paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle that had once represented the pinnacle of her ambitions. "No," she said, looking back at the room full of people who had shared her professional life but had never really known her. "I'll be trading everything I worked for everything I should have been working toward." Margaret Chen walked out of the boardroom and took the elevator down 42 floors to street level, where Samuel was waiting to escort community members to their testimony before the city council. The resignation letter remained on the mahogany table, 3 paragraphs that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. In 6 hours, the city council would vote on whether being homeless would become a criminal offense. By then, Margaret would discover whether the choice she had just made would be sufficient to protect the people who had taught her what choice really meant. The keys to the new community center felt warm in Samuel's palm as he stood before the modest building that would house their first collaborative effort. The brass key ring bore a simple engraving: Second Chances Community Services, Est, 2025. 6 months earlier, this space had been an abandoned warehouse in a neighborhood that city planners had written off as economically unviable. Now it would serve as a bridge between the world Samuel knew and the world Margaret was learning to navigate. Margaret stood beside him on the sidewalk, looking at the building with the same expression she had once reserved for major acquisitions. But instead of calculating profit margins and market penetration, she was envisioning job training programs, transitional housing coordination, and advocacy services that would help people navigate systems designed to exclude them. "Hard to believe it's real," Samuel said, turning the key over in his hand. The victory at the city council had been decisive but exhausting. Margaret's coordination of business community opposition, combined with compelling testimony from homeless community members, had defeated Proposition 847 by a vote of 7-2. But winning one battle had only clarified the scope of the war they were fighting. "Dorothy says we have 12 people ready to start the job training program next week," Margaret said, consulting the notebook that had replaced her corporate portfolio. "Tommy's volunteered to teach basic carpentry skills, and Maria wants to develop a course on navigating social services bureaucracy." Samuel smiled at the mention of their community partners. Dorothy had emerged as a natural administrator, bringing organizational skills that rivaled any corporate manager Margaret had worked with. Tommy's construction expertise was exactly what they needed for the center's renovation and job training programs. Maria's determination to help other families navigate educational and social services had made her invaluable as a case manager. "What about the housing partnership?" Samuel asked. Margaret pulled out a folder thick with agreements and permits. "We're closing on the apartment building next Friday. 15 units of transitional housing with support services on site. The City Housing Authority is providing operational funding for the first 3 years." The apartment building had been Margaret's idea, a practical application of her business skills to address the most immediate need facing their community. Instead of traditional homeless shelters that required people to leave during the day and follow institutional rules designed for crisis management, the transitional housing would provide stability that could support long-term changes. Samuel unlocked the front door of the community center, and they walked into the space that represented 6 months of planning, fundraising, and construction. The interior still smelled of fresh paint and new carpet, but the basic layout was complete: meeting rooms for support groups, computer stations for job applications, a kitchen for community meals, and offices for case management services. "Remember when you first approached me with this idea?" Samuel said, running his hand along the reception desk that Tommy had built from reclaimed wood. "I thought you were suffering from guilt-induced temporary insanity." Margaret laughed, a sound that would have been impossible in her corner office, but came naturally in this space she had helped create. "You weren't wrong about the guilt, but the insanity turned out to be productive." Samuel pulled his weathered notebook from his backpack and opened it to a page marked with a ribbon bookmark. "I wrote about that conversation." "Want to hear what I said?" Margaret nodded, settling into one of the comfortable chairs they had arranged in the main meeting area. Samuel read in his careful voice. "Margaret Chen asked me today if I would help her start an organization that provides services to homeless people. I told her I needed time to think about it, but what I really need time to do is figure out if she's serious about this, or if she's just trying to feel better about herself. She has money and connections, but money and connections without understanding can do more harm than good. The question is whether she's willing to learn from the people she wants to help, or whether she just wants to feel like a savior. Margaret winced slightly. What conclusion did you reach? Samuel flipped through several pages. 3 weeks later, I wrote, Margaret shows up every day. She listens more than she talks. She takes direction from Dorothy and doesn't get defensive when Tommy criticizes her ideas. She's learning that helping people isn't about having the right intentions. It's about building the right relationships. I think I'm ready to trust her with something important. Margaret felt the weight of that trust as she looked around the community center. Every detail of the space had been designed through collaboration with the people who would use it. The computers were positioned to provide privacy for job applications. The meeting rooms could be configured for different group sizes. The kitchen was equipped to serve both individual meals and community gatherings. Samuel, Margaret said, I need to tell you something about the board meeting where I resigned. Samuel closed his notebook and gave her his full attention. Richard Morrison said something that's been bothering me for months. He said I was choosing homeless people over business relationships, as if those were the only two options available. Margaret paused, gathering her thoughts. But what I realized in that moment was that I wasn't choosing between two different groups of people. I was choosing between two different versions of myself. Samuel nodded. The version that could sign termination orders without seeing the faces of the people affected, and the version that sits in community meetings and takes notes about Tommy's housing applications. Exactly. And what I've learned is that the second version is not only more ethical, she's more effective. When I made decisions from the corner office, I was working with abstractions. Now I'm working with people I know personally, solving problems I understand completely. Samuel stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the neighborhood, where many of their community members lived in conditions that ranged from precarious to dangerous. You know what the biggest difference is between corporate problem solving and community problem solving? Margaret waited. In corporate settings, you can declare victory when the numbers improve. In community work, you can only declare victory when people's lives improve. And people's lives are complicated in ways that don't show up on spreadsheets. Margaret joined him at the window. Like Jerry's heart medication that costs more than his monthly income, even though the generic version would work just as well. Like Lisa's inability to get stable housing because her credit report includes medical debt from an emergency room visit she couldn't afford. Like Tommy's construction skills that are constantly in demand, but his lack of permanent address makes him ineligible for jobs to provide health insurance. Samuel smiled. You're learning to think like an advocate instead of an executive. Margaret pulled the community center keys from her pocket and handed them to Samuel. These belong to you. This place exists because of the community you helped build over the past 5 years. I just provided some of the resources. Samuel accepted the keys, but immediately handed them back. Partnership means shared responsibility. Besides, I'm going to need help figuring out how to manage 15 units of transitional housing, job training programs, and case management services. Margaret looked at the keys in her palm, simple brass objects that represented the most meaningful work she had ever undertaken. Are you sure you want to trust me with this much responsibility? Samuel's expression grew serious. Margaret, 6 months ago, you were a CEO who thought homeless people were someone else's problem. Today, you're a community advocate who understands that homeless people are everyone's responsibility. That kind of personal transformation doesn't happen by accident. Margaret thought about the notebook she had been keeping observations about dignity and resilience. notes about the creativity required to solve problems without resources, reflections on the community bonds that formed when people took care of each other because no one else would. "I need to ask you something," Margaret said. "The night you found me in that car, did you know who I was?" Samuel shook his head. "Not until you told me your name. But if you had known, if you had recognized me as the CEO who signed your termination papers, would you still have helped me?" Samuel considered the question seriously. "I hope so, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." Margaret understood what he meant. The accident had stripped away their respective identities, corporate, executive, and terminated employee, and reduced them to their essential humanity. Samuel had seen someone who needed help and provided it. Margaret had experienced kindness from a stranger and been transformed by it. "The partnership agreement," Margaret said, pulling the document from her folder. "Are you ready to make this official?" Samuel took the papers and read through the terms they had negotiated over months of discussion. The agreement established Second Chance's community services as a collaborative effort, with shared decision-making authority and clear protocols for resolving disagreements. It included the safeguards Samuel had insisted upon: his right to withdraw if the organization stopped serving the community's needs. Samuel signed his name with the same careful attention he brought to his journal entries. Margaret signed with the Mont-Blanc pen she had once used for corporate contracts. But now her signature represented something entirely different: a commitment to use her skills and resources in service of people who had been excluded from the systems that had made her wealthy. As they stood in the community center holding the signed agreement, Margaret realized that the keys in her other hand represented more than access to a building. They represented access to a version of herself she had never known existed, someone who measured success by the lives she could improve rather than the profits she could generate. The brass keyring caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and Margaret could see her reflection in the polished metal. The face looking back at her was older than the one that had stared out from the corner office, marked by months of learning about struggles she had previously ignored. But it was also more alive, more connected, more purposeful than any reflection she remembered from her corporate years. Samuel tucked the partnership agreement into his weathered notebook, where it joined 5 years of observations about survival, dignity, and the power of mutual aid. Margaret placed the keys in her leather journal, where they would rest among 3 months of education about community, connection, and the revolutionary idea that asking, "Are you okay?" could be the beginning rather than the end of a conversation. Outside, the neighborhood was beginning to stir with the activity of people returning from work, children playing in small front yards, and the subtle networks of mutual support that kept vulnerable communities functioning. Margaret and Samuel locked the community center behind them, but they carried its promise with them. The promise that 2 people from opposite sides of an economic divide could create something powerful enough to change not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone their partnership could reach. The new business card felt different in Samuel's fingers than any credential he had carried during his 15 years in corporate life. The simple white cardstock bore his name in elegant black font: Samuel Martinez, Community Outreach Director, Second Chance's Community Services. Below his name, a phone number and email address that connected him to a network of services, advocacy efforts, and community partnerships that had grown far beyond what he and Margaret had imagined possible. 6 months after the community center's opening, Samuel sat in the same spot in Meridian Park where Margaret had first found him. But the bench now served a different purpose. Instead of a refuge for journal writing and quiet observation, it had become an unofficial office where people came to discuss housing applications, job training opportunities, and the complex navigation of systems designed to help them rebuild their lives. "Morning, Samuel," called Maria as she approached with her son David, who was now in his 2nd semester at community college. "David wanted to thank you for the scholarship recommendation letter." Samuel looked up from his notebook, not the weathered spiral-bound journal of his homeless years, but a professional portfolio that contained meeting notes, program evaluations, and strategic plans for expanding their services. David earned that scholarship himself, Samuel said, standing to shake the young man's hand. I just made sure the selection committee understood what he had accomplished despite his circumstances. David, now 19 and carrying himself with the confidence that came from stable housing and educational opportunities, smiled with the gratitude of someone who understood how dramatically his life trajectory had changed. Mr. Martinez, I wanted you to know that I'm planning to study social work. I want to help other families like ours. Samuel felt the familiar warmth that came from watching someone transform crisis into purpose. David's family had been among the first residents of the transitional housing program, and his success in college had become a model for other young people facing similar challenges. After Maria and David continued on their way, Samuel returned to his notebook and the task that had brought him to the park that morning, reviewing applications for the new job training programs that Margaret had developed with input from local employers. Margaret herself arrived 20 minutes later, walking across the grass with the purposeful stride that had once carried her through corporate boardrooms but now navigated community meetings and funding presentations with equal effectiveness. How many applications? She asked, settling onto the bench beside Samuel. 47 for the 12 slots in the computer literacy program, 32 for the 10 positions in the carpentry training, and 61 people interested in the business skills workshop. Margaret consulted her own notebook, a leather-bound journal that had evolved from a record of her search for Samuel into a comprehensive documentation of their organization's growth and impact. We're going to need to expand faster than we planned. Samuel looked at Margaret's face, noting how the past year had changed her appearance in ways that had nothing to do with aging. The sharp angles of corporate stress had been replaced by the softer lines of someone who slept well at night, who woke up knowing that her work mattered in ways she could see and measure directly. The housing authority called this morning, Margaret said. They want to partner with us on a new 50-unit development. Permanent supportive housing with on-site services. Samuel smiled at the irony. A year ago, Margaret had been fleeing the corporate world, convinced that business skills were incompatible with community service. Now she was discovering that her decades of experience in strategic planning, financial management, and organizational development were exactly what effective advocacy required. What did you tell them? That we'd need to hire more case managers, expand our mental health services, and develop new partnerships with healthcare providers. Margaret paused, flipping through her notebook. I also told them we'd need to involve the community in designing the programs from the beginning. Samuel nodded approvingly. Margaret had learned that sustainable social services required input from the people who would use them, that effective programs grew from community needs rather than institutional assumptions. Speaking of community input, Samuel said, Dorothy wants to expand the peer counseling program. She's identified 6 people who could be trained as certified peer specialists. Margaret made a note in her journal. Budget? Manageable if we get the foundation grant we applied for last month. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the neighborhood activity that surrounded them. Meridian Park had changed over the past year, evolving from a place where homeless people gathered for safety and mutual support into a community hub, where people of all economic circumstances came for services, social connection, and shared activities. The transformation hadn't been accidental. Margaret and Samuel had worked with city planners to install better lighting, improve landscaping, and create spaces that welcomed families and children. The park now hosted a weekly farmers market, evening educational programs, and community meetings that brought together housed and unhoused residents to address neighborhood concerns collaboratively. Samuel, Margaret said, pulling an envelope from her jacket pocket. I got a call from Elena yesterday. Samuel's expression grew still. What did she say? She wanted my phone number. She's been following news coverage of our work, and she wants to talk with you. Samuel took the envelope, recognizing his ex-wife's handwriting on the address. He had not spoken with Elena in over 2 years, since their divorce was finalized and she had moved to Arizona with their children. She said she's proud of what you've built, Margaret continued gently. She said it reminded her of the man she fell in love with. Samuel opened the envelope carefully, revealing a letter written on paper that still carried the faint scent of Elena's perfume. The first paragraph contained the words he had been hoping to hear for 5 years. Samuel, I made a mistake when I gave up on us. I was scared and overwhelmed, and I couldn't see past our immediate crisis to remember who you were underneath it all. But watching what you've accomplished with Margaret, seeing how you've used your experience to help other people, I remember now why I loved you. Samuel read the entire letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it back in the envelope. She wants to visit, he said quietly. She and the kids. They want to see what I've built here. Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions, joy for Samuel's potential reconciliation with his family, but also awareness that her partnership with him might change if he had the opportunity to rebuild his marriage. How do you feel about that? She asked. Samuel looked at the business card in his other hand, considering the question. A year ago, I would have dropped everything for the chance to get my family back. But now, he paused, searching for the right words. Now I understand that I can't go backward to the person I was before I lost everything. I can only go forward as the person I've become. Margaret understood what he meant. Samuel's experience with homelessness, his 5 years of learning to survive without traditional support systems, his development of skills in community organizing and mutual aid, none of that could be erased by the restoration of his former life. Elena's letter includes an invitation, Samuel continued. She wants to know if I'd consider moving to Arizona to be closer to the kids. She has a good job there, stable housing, and she thinks we could start over. Margaret felt her chest tighten. What did you tell her? I told her I needed to think about it. Samuel tucked the letter into his notebook beside the community center keys. But I also told her that if we're going to rebuild our relationship, it has to include understanding who I am now, not just who I used to be. Margaret looked around the park, imagining how different the landscape would be without Samuel's daily presence. He had become the informal mayor of this community, the person people turn to for advice, advocacy, and the kind of gentle leadership that emerged from shared experience rather than appointed authority. Samuel, if you decide to move to Arizona, what happens to all this? Margaret gestured toward the community center visible in the distance, the transitional housing units they had developed, the network of services and relationships they had built together. Samuel smiled. It continues. Dorothy is ready to take over most of my responsibilities. Tommy has been learning about grant writing and program development. Maria wants to expand into policy advocacy. The community doesn't depend on me anymore. It depends on the systems we've built together. Margaret realized that Samuel was describing the most successful outcome possible for their partnership. They had created something sustainable, something that could survive and grow, even if the people who started it moved on to other challenges. Besides, Samuel added, Arizona has homeless communities too. Elena's city is dealing with many of the same issues we've been addressing here. Maybe it's time to find out if what we've learned here can work in other places. Margaret felt a mixture of loss and pride as she contemplated Samuel's potential departure. Their partnership had been born from an accident, sustained by guilt and gratitude, and transformed into something neither of them had expected, a professional collaboration that had changed both their lives and the lives of hundreds of other people. If you go, Margaret said, I want you to take copies of everything, all our program models, policy templates, community organizing strategies, and I want you to stay in touch. What we've built here shouldn't be limited to one city. Samuel pulled out his phone and showed Margaret a text message he had received that morning. Samuel, this is David Martinez, your son. Mom gave me your number. I've been reading about your work online. I'm proud of you, Dad. I graduate high school next month, and I want to study community development in college. Can we talk? Margaret read the message and felt tears spring to her eyes. Your son wants to follow in your footsteps. Our footsteps, Samuel corrected. David's been reading about Second Chance's community services. He's interested in the partnership model we developed, bringing together people with different backgrounds and resources to address complex social problems. Margaret looked at Samuel's business card again, understanding now that it represented more than his individual transformation. It represented a model for how people could cross economic and social boundaries to create solutions that neither could achieve alone. There's something I want to give you, Margaret said, pulling a small wrapped package from her bag. A going-away present, even though you haven't decided to go yet. Samuel unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal identical to the one Margaret carried. The cover was embossed with simple gold lettering. Samuel Martinez, Community Advocate. I thought you might want to start documenting your work in Arizona the same way you documented your observations here, Margaret said. Your weathered notebook contains 5 years of wisdom about survival and dignity. This one can hold whatever comes next. Samuel ran his fingers over the smooth leather cover, feeling the weight of new possibilities. Margaret, what will you do if I leave? Margaret looked around the park, seeing not just the physical space, but the network of relationships and services that extended throughout the neighborhood and beyond. I'll keep learning. Dorothy and Tommy and Maria have been teaching me things about community organizing that I never learned in business school. I'll apply for that policy fellowship with the mayor's office and work on housing reform at the city level. Samuel smiled. From CEO to community advocate to policy reformer. That's quite a journey. It started with a simple question, Margaret said. When you asked if I was okay that night, you weren't just asking about my physical injuries. You were asking if I was okay as a person, if my life was meaningful, if I was connected to something larger than myself, if I had any purpose beyond accumulating money and status. Samuel nodded. And what's your answer now? Margaret looked at her own notebook, filled with stories of transformation and connection. Records of programs that had changed lives and policies that had been reformed. I'm okay now. For the first time in decades, I'm actually okay. A year later, Margaret stood in the same spot in Meridian Park, reading a letter that had arrived that morning from Phoenix, Arizona. Samuel's handwriting filled 3 pages with updates about the community center he and Elena had opened together, about their reconciliation and remarriage, about their son David's success in his first year studying social work. The Phoenix program is working, Samuel wrote. We've housed 47 people in our first 8 months, and the job training programs have a 90% completion rate. Elena brings skills in healthcare administration that complement the community development work. And David spends his summers here learning about direct service delivery. Margaret smiled as she read Samuel's description of their expanding network of services. The partnership model they had developed, bringing together people with different backgrounds and resources to address complex social problems, was proving effective in multiple cities. But the most important thing I want to tell you, Samuel's letter continued, is that every morning when I unlock the doors of our community center, I think about that night when I found you in the car, not because of what happened to you, but because of what happened to both of us afterward. You asked me once if I would have helped you if I had known who you were. Now, I can answer that question. Yes, I would have helped you, because that's who I had learned to be. But I never would have imagined that helping you would lead to all this. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in her current notebook, Volume 4 of her documentation of community advocacy work. She had filled 3 journals since Samuel's departure, recording the expansion of their programs, the development of new partnerships, and her own continued education in the complexities of social change. The business card in her wallet now read, Chen, Policy Director, Second Chances Community Services. But her role had evolved far beyond what any job title could capture. She spent her days testifying before city council committees, training other communities to develop similar programs, and writing grants that would fund the next generation of innovations in supportive services. But she also spent time doing the direct service work that kept her connected to the human faces behind policy abstractions. Every Tuesday, she volunteered in the community center's resource room, helping people fill out job applications and navigate social services bureaucracy. Every Thursday, she brought lunch to the park and shared meals with whoever was hungry. As Margaret walked home from the park that evening, she passed the luxury apartment building where she had lived during her corporate years. The penthouse windows glowed with warm light, probably illuminating another CEO's corner office view of the city. Margaret felt no nostalgia for that height, no regret for the perspective she had traded away. Instead, she felt gratitude for the accident that had brought her down to street level, for the stranger who had asked if she was okay, and for the education she had received from people who had learned to thrive despite circumstances that would have crushed her former self. Margaret's current apartment was smaller, less expensive, and located in the neighborhood where most of her community center clients lived. From her windows, she could see the transitional housing units that had been their first major project, the job training facility that Tommy now managed, and the community garden where Dorothy coordinated youth programs that brought together children from housed and unhoused families. The view from street level, Margaret had learned, was not diminished by lack of height. It was enriched by proximity, deepened by connection, and made meaningful by the understanding that asking, "Are you okay?" was never just a question. It was an invitation to recognize shared humanity and act on the responsibility that recognition required. As she settled into her evening routine, Margaret opened her newest notebook and began writing the day's observations. The leather journal was identical to the one she had given Samuel as a farewell gift, purchased from the same shop where she had bought her first community advocacy notebook 2 years earlier. Tuesday evening, she wrote in the careful script she had developed for this more personal form of documentation. Letter from Samuel today. Phoenix program expanding to serve families, not just individuals. Elaine's healthcare background proving invaluable for addressing medical needs that complicate housing stability. David considering transfer to university. Here next year to complete social work degree with field experience at our program. Margaret paused in her writing, thinking about the circular nature of the relationships that had grown from that rainy night, when 2 strangers had encountered each other in circumstances neither had chosen. The question, "Are you okay?" has become the foundation of everything we do, she continued writing. Not just the words, but the intention behind them, the genuine curiosity about another person's well-being, the willingness to listen to the answer, and the commitment to act on what we learn. Samuel asked me that question when I was trapped in twisted metal and broken glass. Now we ask it every day in different ways. Are you housed? Are you fed? Are you safe? Are you connected to people who care about you? Are you able to contribute your gifts to something larger than yourself? Margaret closed the notebook and placed it on her bedside table, next to the framed photograph that Samuel had given her before leaving for Arizona. The image showed the community center on opening day, with Margaret and Samuel standing beside the front door surrounded by the people whose lives had been touched by their partnership. Dorothy with her organizational genius, Tommy with his construction skills and quiet wisdom, Maria with her fierce advocacy for educational opportunities, Jerry with his medication finally regulated and his housing finally stable. In the photograph, Margaret and Samuel were both holding keys, not just to the building behind them, but to a model of collaboration that had proven powerful enough to cross economic boundaries, bridge social divisions, and create lasting change in multiple communities. As Margaret turned off the light and settled into sleep, she understood that the accident that had brought her and Samuel together had been random, but everything that followed had been choice. Two people from opposite sides of an economic divide had chosen to trust each other, to learn from each other, and to use their combined resources in service of people who had been excluded from most systems of support. The simple question, "Are you okay?" had become a way of life, a professional methodology, and a reminder that the distance between one human heart and another was always shorter than it appeared from the heights of corporate success or the depths of social abandonment. Margaret Chen fell asleep in her modest apartment, surrounded by the sounds of the neighborhood she now called home, grateful for the stranger who had pulled her from a wrecked car and asked the question that had changed everything. In Phoenix, Samuel Martinez fell asleep beside the wife he had thought he'd lost forever, holding the letter he would send tomorrow to the woman who had helped him transform 5 years of loss into a lifetime of purpose. Both of them carried business cards that identified them as community advocates, but they measured their success by standards that no corporate quarterly report could capture. Lives stabilized, families reunited, communities strengthened, and the revolutionary idea that asking, "Are you okay?" was not the end of a conversation, but the beginning of a commitment to make sure the answer could eventually be yes.